Hello and welcome to Macrobasics 3, the long overdue Macrobasics 3 that I was meant to be presenting months and months ago. Yet here we are all the way in March. So without further ado, we'll get started with this video. And as you can see, I am joined by, well, for the rest of the series, I'm joined by Dan. So Dan, how are you doing?
Who the fuck are you?
What do you mean?
What is going on? No, I'm joking. It's weird. I finally get to see my kidnapper.
Yeah.
I get to see them face to face. Yes, this is a bit weird, isn't it? But
Yeah.
there we go. This is like a face reveal, but we haven't even got 100 subjects. This is cheating.
Yeah. And it's weird because we're also talking to the camera, which is different to usual. But
Yeah, oh yeah, I should be looking at the camera, shouldn't I? There goes.
yeah, no, it takes some getting used to, but I'm sure over time we'll
Yeah.
get better at it.
Yeah. But no, to answer your question, fantastic. This is eerie, to say the least, because we're not used to doing this, are we? Even when we're talking, we just use an audio link. We don't face chat time like this. We decided just to do this just randomly, and it's well, it'll be touch and go, won't it?
Yeah, think of this as the pilot episode, even though it says
Yes,
Macrobasics 3.
this is going to be a pilot run, definitely.
Yeah, so expect us to be ambitious, but for everything to go wrong, essentially. But yeah,
We'll see.
hopefully we'll get some things right. And today we're starting with quite a, well, I was about to say quite relaxed topic, but actually, for a beginner, it can be quite taxing because there's quite a lot of new concepts to get used to. So we'll try and introduce you to them, sort of give a brief explanation, try and provide some contemporary examples of where we would see this. And then, yeah, obviously, if you guys have any questions, then leave them in the comments. But without further ado, let's get started. So, as you can see here, we've got a standard ADAS diagram, which I'm hoping that Dan's also looking at if my PowerPoint is working.
We're doing it very oddly, but yeah, well, I'm following.
Okay. So, as you can see here, this diagram for the initiated is missing quite a few labels. So you're missing your 0 point here. You're missing sort of APL star, and well, you could list this as Q star, I guess, for real GDP, even though it's not quantity. But yeah, this is just to give you a basic idea of the ADAS diagram. So I think we'll go through what AD and AS are if you don't know what they already are. But basically, as you can see here, we have two sloping lines, obviously AD sloping downwards, AS sloping upwards. And Dan, do you want to explain why these two lines slope the way they do?
This is ironic because I've already explained this in another video. Having not released that video yet, of course, we're going to have to explain it again. So this follows on from, as I'm hoping by the time this comes out, you would have watched my supply and demand video. Remember, the supply states that, well, we're using the same axis here. We had a price axis on our micro diagram, average price level axis on our vertical axis in the macro diagram, and essentially they work in the same way for our model. They mean different things. The average price level is a measure of inflation, essentially. It's like an aggregated price level across the whole economy, is like an index, but it works in the same way that a normal price would. So our aggregate supply curve slopes positive, with a positive correlation between real GDP and average price level, and you can think of that as the rate of inflation increases, well, then we would expect an increase in output as well for supply, because again, we talked about in the micro video about this idea for incentive supplier. As price increases, well, they'll have an incentive to increase their production. And so that's where that positive relationship goes. We'll actually talk about the Phillips curve at some point, which I think actually captures this relationship much better. But we'll work on that. But yeah, essentially, inflation and real GDP correlate positively, as you would expect.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the Phillips curve is something we'll talk about a little bit later on in this series, whenever we do bring this series back full time. At the moment, sort of in the works. But yeah, no, I think it's quite the Phillips curve in particular. Once you get to it, is a very interesting model. Although obviously, like all economic models, it has its flaws. Um, as Dan gave us a brief overview of ADAS, this is sort of our equation defining aggregate demand. So we have AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So what does this actually mean in plain English? AD obviously is aggregate demand. We then have this equating to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So your net exports essentially. And obviously if you're a country that imports more than it exports, then you're going to have a negative value. And therefore this will take away from your aggregate demand. And in future videos, we'll go more into depth with this equation. There's whole things to do with consumption and equations and components of consumption. And again, we can talk about how investment's affected, but at the moment, this is just a brief snapshot of what AD is. I think I've given sort of a brief overview of what it is, unless Dan, you've got something to add.
ADAS. The only things we could mention are some of the characteristics between the ADAS and the way they behave compared to micro. Is on a micro level, we analyze the law of supply and demand in terms of incentives for consumers and suppliers based on their preferences. But then on a macro level, you can also link things like diminishing law of returns. So that positive sloping curve for an ADAS curve. It's linear as we would expect, but of course the reason why you see an upwards in price level is because as output is increasing in an economy, you might see the cost of materials for a firm to increase, and so that then translates into higher prices. And then aggregate demand slopes downwards. In actually that case, actually pretty similar to the way you would expect with the micro model as well, but also things because of like the wealth effect, for example. So of course, if you're experiencing high levels of real GDP and wealth effect, well, increase in demand, but we'll show that through shifts soon. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, that AD equation there particularly is our focus: consumption, investment, government spending, and of course, net exports.
Yeah, no, exactly. And actually, it's an interesting point that you talk about the wealth effect, because we were just doing this in our university course earlier. Actually, we were talking about how real wealth and sort of wealth goals affect a household's consumption, essentially. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it.
Function.
Sorry?
Keynesian consumption function?
I don't think we've quite... I don't know if it's got that name. Maybe it does, but I don't think I've quite learned the name for it. But all I know so far is...
We'll cover that when we get to more advanced. This is... we're talking the most basic form of macro model you can get. We should also do a disclaimer saying actually that there are many models to model the macro economy. This is the most basic and fundamental one. It's most simplistic easily. It doesn't really do much in terms of really accurately explaining how a macro economy works. It just gives you some really basic intuition. Everything that happens in the diagram is assumed to be almost exogenous. Something else happens outside the model that we then show. It's just purely to observe. You don't actually get much explanatory power from it. That's one thing to maybe note there.
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point. And yeah, as you say, this is I guess the most basic in relative terms. Obviously there's still quite a lot to unpack, which we'll see. But yeah, we've talked about AD so far, about AS. So let's actually go on to the diagram, or to the first of a series of diagrams. The first diagram we've got showing here, and this will sort of be a progression to show how this would actually play out in this model. But as you can see here, we have a shift from AD to AD1. And obviously in this snapshot in time, AS remains the same, but we'll explore later how AS will actually react. So as we talked about earlier, there's different components of AD. So this shift in AD could be as a result of, I don't know, a decrease in income tax, for example, which would obviously give consumers a more more disposable income, so perhaps their propensity to consume might change. They'll consume more, and obviously this will drive up consumption and will drive up your aggregate demand, which is obviously shown by the shift. Then once we actually expand the model, we can see that there's a reaction in aggregate supply from AS to AS1, and this is a leftward shift. So Dan, do you want to explain why we have these, like, this counteracting shift essentially?
Yeah. So if we start from the beginning with the AD shift, again, we remember as we said before, this is an exogenous thing. We can link it particularly with AD. When we cause a rightward shift, we're saying that something is increasing, because if you follow the diagram, if you just take any price level point across the two curves, obviously you'll notice that all price levels output has increased. So that must mean something in our AD equation, remember the consumption, government spending, investment, and net exports must have increased. So as Martin said in this example, it would be a tax reduction. So that would, of course, mostly stimulate consumption, because we're targeting maybe VAT or income tax, so people have more disposable income, so they buy more. So consumption increases and AD shifts outwards. We call that demand pull inflation. Along what happens initially, of course, you'll see in this curve is you'll see that AD shifts to AD1 outwards, and we operate at a new temporary equilibrium along AD1 and AS where they meet. That, of course, as you can see without any lines plotted, you normally point lines to make this more obvious. But if you just follow the equilibrium point down, you'll see higher GDP and higher average price levels. So we've got an expansion in growth and expansionary inflation, essentially inflationary pressure. But in this example, and we'll get on to this, we assume we're operating at full output. So this isn't really sustainable for firms. So firms have to react in order to sustain this output. And of course, as over time demand increases and prices increases, well, firms see their cost of increase as well. So they, of course, have to pay more for more materials. They have to pay more to employ staff to meet this level of demand. And so, of course, they push their prices up as well. So we move along, if you like, this AS curve, but we represent as a shift. So AS shifts upwards to reflect an increase in that price level. Because remember, we're saying that firms face higher costs in the long run because this demand isn't sustainable forever. They have to employ more people, and so they pass that cost on to consumers. So price level increases even further. But what you'll notice is the new equilibrium along AS1 and AD1, in terms of real GDP, it's back at the same level as we saw before. And that is because, as we said, this output isn't sustainable forever. An economy, unless you invest in long growth, so more factors of production, an economy only has so many factors of production, only, in this case, labor, for example. There's only so many people they can employ before they run out and prices increases. And so once the price increases enough, consumers stop demanding it, and then we fall back to that original level of output again. So what we're showing here is essentially demand pull inflation and then a bit of cost push inflation all in one. It's like this self-correct.
Yes. Actually, just something I really wanted to briefly touch on is we're talking about this all in a rather abstract manner about how this would be affected in a snapshot. But why are governments concerned with this stuff? So real GDP, average price level, because we haven't really talked about why that's important. So I think what we'll briefly talk about is the macroeconomic objectives of a government, just so we can see what the government's trying to achieve, or what the economy in a self-correcting state is essentially trying to reach an equilibrium of. So if Dan's still there, which hopefully due to technical issues he still will be.
Hello. Have I gone, please?
Oh, I can hear you. It's all good. Right.
Oh, can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you as well.
Excellent. Fantastic.
Cool. So if I forget any, obviously Dan, just jump in. So the key macroeconomic policies for a government are obviously moderate and sustained growth. You want this also coupled with moderate inflation, which will briefly explain why you want moderate inflation, why you don't want low inflation, or even high inflation. Obviously, I'd imagine you guys know about hyperinflation as well, being a rather troublesome affair. obviously you want low unemployment. Uh, what are the,
He's
what are the other ones?
remembering them.
Something about balance of payments, wasn't there? I think.
Yeah. So, yeah, go on. See if you go.
Okay. So,
You
yeah, I guess
remember it.
improved balance of payments, would that be the correct terming?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sort of. So yeah, you tend the ones you've got sort of like high in sustainable economic growth, but we say high, but we mean sustainable, so
Mm,
moderate in a sense. That's fine. Low inflation, as you said, we want it. As we said, we don't want it or moderate low, same thing really, but it's
mm.
sustainable. Again, unemployment you mentioned, and the balance of payments. Yeah, so it's referred to as a satisfactory balance of payments, and that's a bit vague, I know.
Yeah.
But what that means is you because some countries will naturally see a deficit in balance payments. And if you don't know what that means, don't worry, we'll move on. But it's just avoiding large deficits that place a burden on your financial reserves, essentially. So essentially, when we talk about balance of payments, what we're talking about in real terms is imports exports. A country that's importing a ton more than it's exporting. Well, it's not sustainable forever, is it? Because that means a lot more capital is leaving the country than coming in. That's all we mean. So it's
Mm.
sustainable. There's a sustainable flow of money, let's call it that way, coming in and out of the country.
Yeah. Yeah. No. At this stage, that's all you really need to know. Beyond that, so obviously we'll go more in depth in the future about balance of payments and all these other things. But at the moment, we just need to give a brief overview of why governments are concerned with this and why we don't. Yeah, go on.
Hmm?
Yeah, sorry, I thought you were saying something.
No.
Okay.
Carry on with your lecture, professor.
Thank you very much. I guess I'll take it the compliment. Mm. So, yeah, so this is essentially why governments have to keep an eye on average price level. So obviously you don't want this average price level increasing too much. So obviously governments have to keep an eye on how AS will react, and obviously there's ways that they can affect the demand and supply side, which we'll touch upon later on when we focus on macroeconomic policy, but
Yeah.
that's a topic for a later video. The final thing I wanted to have a look at was this idea of long-run aggregate supply, which is the neoclassical approach to economics. There's also Keynesian, but we'll touch on that later on because that's a whole different school of thought to unravel, and it's way too much content to cover in one video. So,
Yeah.
as you can see here, we have the AD and AS diagram as we had before. Imagine that we have these shifts again from AD to AD1, and then we have this shift from AS to AS1. As you know, if we have these points labelled, so say we have the intersection between AD and AS labelled as point A, and then we had the intersection between AS1 and AD1 labelled as point C, and then we had the intersection between AS and AD1 labelled as B, which I know seems rather confusing, and later on we'll reshoot this with proper diagrams and with the proper labels and all that. But essentially, as Nan pointed out earlier, essentially initially we have this transition from point A to point B, where we initially have this shift from AD to AD1, and then we have a transition from point B to point C, where we have the shift from AS to AS1. And this is because, as Dan said, this is unsustainable. This point B here, in terms of real GDP, is beyond the sort of would it be correct to say production frontier? That wouldn't be correct. But the long run output, potential output of the economy, right? Was that be a better way of
It
it?
would actually be you're right with the production possibility frontier. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that long run aggregate supply curve, that perfectly inelastic or vertical curve, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, it's that's the reason why. I mean, we probably could have actually explained this better with this model here. Basically, what this long run aggregate supply curve shows is the economy at full employment. So that's employing all of our resources. So all of our facts production, land, labor, entrepreneurship, capital, and maybe human capital if you make the argument that's a one as well. And yeah, essentially what that says is there's like a level of full employment. So if, as we said, if you think about it, there's always a natural level of unemployment, and that is that point. If you can go beyond that temporarily, of course, you know, you can use more resources than you've got in a sense because you can employ extra people who are structurally unemployed, for example. But because we haven't invested in more capital in the future, well, we can only overburn it for so much before we have to go back to our equilibrium point. And that is why you see that inflationary pressure and the movement back towards our YFE, or where the intersection, or where LRAS lies on our real GDP curve. So yeah, it's almost like a constraint. But of course, there are ways we can shift that outwards as well. But yeah, Martin's right about the possibility production frontier curve, which I'll cover, which shows that sort of relationship where you can't move beyond that.
Yeah, obviously, just to point out, obviously you can operate within your PPF, which is showing that the economy is inefficient. And again, we'll cover this when we do the PPF diagram video, which might be even the next video. I think it would make sense maybe for that to be the
Yeah, I'll do it in
next
Macrobasics next.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, no, Dan's completely correct about how obviously this the RAS shows where the economy is at full unemployment, at full employment and lowest unemployment, obviously, which is also you can consider the NAIRU, which we'll talk about again later on. We don't really need to know this at this point because that's again something to do with the Phillips curve. But it's just interesting to know what this RAS actually shows beyond just being on a diagram. So that's the sort of wider economic explanation for it. But I think that's everything we wanted to cover in this video. It's just going to be a short video about ADAS. Obviously, there's quite a lot to unpack, so we'll do quite a few individual videos going over more specific key areas. We might even do a separate case study video because I know I said at the beginning we would talk about a case study or real life examples, but again that would take quite a bit of time. So yeah, I'll probably record another video talking about how you can relate these concepts to a real life scenario, and hopefully that should be instructive. Unless Dan, you've got anything to add, then maybe we can wrap this up.
Yeah, that's everything, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, remember this is only an explanation video. We will go into the wider specifics of each thing. You know, if you're a bit confused as to why everything moves, what needs to happen in which phase or what triggers it, don't worry. This is just to give you an explanation of how we would represent it on a diagram. We'll actually cover the specific ones in subsequent videos.
So yeah, guys, if you found this instructive, then please leave a like and subscribe. As I said before, this format, if you guys find this format better or worse or whatever, then please leave it in the comments. We always appreciate any feedback. And yeah, please enjoy your evening, morning or afternoon or whenever you're watching this. But for now, goodbye.